In April 1887, on the frozen gravel of Montana's Black Ridge Basin, a penniless widow named Clara Vance dropped to her knees and began burying 20 bushels of sunflower seeds directly against the base logs of her cabin. Around her stood veteran timbermen hauling 20 cords of split red fir and sealing stone foundations against an Arctic winter that had killed 12 families the year prior. The entire valley expected her to freeze in an unheated grave before Thanksgiving. What they did not expect was that when the deadliest blizzard in frontier history obliterated their fortified homes, this fragile wall of dry weeds would do something that broke every law of frontier construction. How did a starving widow turn a ring of dead flower stalks into a thermodynamic fortress that defeated 40 below zero cold? Clara's cabin sat 2 miles north of the Bitterroot timber line, where prairie ended and bare granite ridges began. The house was 40 feet long, built of lodgepole pine logs that warped in summer and shrank in winter until mud chinking fell out like dry sand. 4 years earlier, her husband Thomas walked into a blinding November squall to latch the sheep pen. He carried an iron lantern and an axe. The storm erased fences in 10 minutes. They found his frozen body 4 days later inside a drift 60 yards from the door. His wool coat still hung from the iron spike behind the door, smelling of old snow. His splitting maul rested beside the cold stove. Nothing in that corner had moved since the morning 4 neighbors carried his frozen frame across the threshold on a cedar plank. Her 8-year-old daughter, Nora, dragged a canvas sack of seed through dead grass. Beside her walked Buck, an old dog with torn ears and scarred ribs. Nora dropped 3 seeds into each furrow, and Clara packed soil with the heel of her boot. They did not plant outward toward rich creek loam. They planted in an unbroken ring, hugging base logs of all 4 walls. By the 3rd afternoon, the ring was complete. A dark band of turned soil encircled the cabin foundation like a moat. From across the boundary fence, Silas Thorne pulled his bay gelding to a stop. Thorne owned 600 sheep and 4,000 acres of valley bottom. He had built 2 stone barns that survived 30 winters without losing a shingle. He rested his arm on the saddle horn and stared at the dark furrow. Spring planting belongs in the lower bench, Mrs. Vance, Thorne said, his voice flat and heavy. That gravel against your wall won't grow grain enough to feed a single milk cow through frost. Clara did not look up. She smoothed wet loam over the seed line and reached into the sack. "It is not for feed," she said. Thorne waited for the rest of the thought. Wind rattled dry cedar shakes on the roof. The dog sat down between horse and child, yellow eyes fixed on the gelding's knees. No further words came from the trench. "Wet dirt against pine logs breeds white rot," Thorne said, pulling his rein tight. 10 homesteaders tried farming this high bench alone. Every single one froze out or starved out before their 5th winter. Clara drove the point of her trowel into rocky ground. "The cabin has its own work," she said. Thorne turned his gelding south toward the Bitterroot settlement. Before sunset, news reached the counter at Vance Gable's Mercantile, where valley men gathered around the stove to settle lumber accounts. Gable dipped his pen into black ink and laughed out loud. "The widow is planting flower beds against her foundation to stop 30 below gales," Gable told teamsters sitting on salt barrels. "She will beg for credit on flour and cordwood before freeze up." At the sawmill, Angus Reed was truing an 8-inch beam. Reed had notched corner pins for half the cabins from Helena to the Idaho border. He spat tobacco into sawdust and shook his head. "Pine logs need dry air and daylight," Reed said, tapping his square against his apron. "Wrap a cabin in green brush, and you get rot by August, woodlice by October, and mice through floorboards before first snow. A cabin is a timber frame. You cannot dress it in weeds." Within a week, the basin gave the homestead a new name, the Sunflower Widow. Clara heard the name when carrying water buckets from the weir. She heard it when the mail wagon passed her gate at a hard trot without stopping. She did not argue with teamsters, nor did she send Nora to town with explanations. Her silence only deepened the valley's belief that grief had broken her mind. By the second week of June, green shoots 3 inches high pushed through gravel around the cabin. Nora knelt by the east foundation at dusk, touching stiff leaves. "Would Father have chopped these down?" the girl asked. Clara stood by the corner post with a 50-foot coil of hempline, watching northern peaks turn the color of iron. "Your father fought Frost with an axe," Clara said. "Frost has more wood than we do. The Ring of Seeds was neither a memorial nor a garden." Years earlier, Clara lived near a Volga German settlement on the Colorado Plateau. Winters there were dry, brutal, and long. Settlers built simple cabins of yellow pine, but never left timber bare to northern winds. In May, they planted sunflowers and winter rye in dense borders against foundations. By September, plants grew into 8-foot ramparts of cellulose, hollow stems, and root networks, pulling tons of moisture from soil. When sap dried out, stalks did not conduct temperature. The interior of every stalk was packed with dry pith cells, holding motionless pockets of air. Clara remembered an old German woman named Greta wrapping a dairy foundation in bundled rye and sunflower stems. Greta tapped the pine sill with her mallet and pointed toward gray prairie clouds. "Cold is an animal searching for bare wood," Greta told her. "Give it a log, and it eats heat from your bones. Give it a coat of dead air, and it breaks its teeth before finding your wall. A solid 6-inch pine log has an insulation value under R8. In 60-mile-per-hour winds, solid wood conducts interior heat straight into the sky. A 30-inch barrier of dried, layered fibrous stalks creates an insulation value of R24. The valley saw useless weeds. Clara saw 5,000 cubic feet of dead air waiting to be built. Labor builds a wall. Physics decides if it stands. On the 10th of August, heat broke with sudden mountain violence. Sky over the Bitterroot Peaks turned from bleached white to anvil blue. A dry squall roared through canyon passes at 50 miles an hour, carrying choking alkali dust. Wind tore the roof from Silas Thorne's sheep shed and flattened 20 acres of standing oats. At the Vance homestead, sunflower stalks stood 8 feet high, 4 deep around the cabin, broad leaves catching the gale. The noise began with a sharp wooden crack. A 60-foot section of the western row buckled. Stalks split at base, spilling green pulp across gravel. Within 20 minutes, the entire western defense lay flattened in dirt like broken lances. Angus Reed was hauling Cedar Bridge timbers when the gale eased. He pulled his team to a halt, set the brake, and walked to the broken fence. "Look at that ruin, Clara," Reed shouted, kicking a broken stalk with his boot. "Your wall died in a 10-minute blow. A post and plank fence would still be standing. Green weed stems snap the moment wind leans on them." Clara came from the cabin carrying split cedar stakes and tarred cord. "A cedar fence costs $30 in spikes and 3 weeks of hauling," she said. "And it does not end flat in the mud," Reed said, hands on hips. "Look at log bases under those fallen leaves. Moisture is trapped against wood. Timber cannot breathe. In 12 months, lower logs will be soft as pudding. When mice find damp shelter, they chew through floorboards before first snow." Reed stated frontier law: damp wood rots, and rotting wood collapses. Silas Thorne rode up behind the wagon and leaned over his saddle. "Cut them down, Clara," Thorne said. "Let August sun-bake sill logs dry before autumn." Clara did not drop her tools. She drove a cedar stake 18 inches into gravel with a wooden maul, striking with steady blows. "The sun only dries what it touches," she said. "The wind only breaks what refuses to bend." When wagons rolled away, Clara did not clear debris. She worked 3 days without stopping. She drove 40 cedar stakes around the perimeter, slanting each inward at 45 degrees. She lifted broken stalks, binding them into an interlocking lattice with tarred twine. Instead of standing stiff, stalks became a flexible web. When evening canyon drafts rolled down, the wall yielded 2 inches, distributed load across 40 tied nodes, and held firm. She turned a broken garden into a living truss. Every knot was tied under tension, braced to bear the mountain weight. She secured each knot with 2 half-hitches, testing the tautness of the hempline against her thumb. The pine logs behind the barrier remained shaded from the blistering sun, while the ground around the foundation began to dry out under the steady summer draft. Inside the cabin, the stillness grew deeper as the outer walls thickened with each passing week. Nora learned to move silently between the courses of dry stalk, checking each corner tie as if inspecting the rigging of a wooden schooner before open sea. The carpenter looks for stiffness. The storm looks for leverage. By the 3rd week of September, mountain air carried the smell of frozen iron. Green drained from sunflower rows in 3 days. Stalks hardened into light, rigid tubes of dry fiber. Clara and Nora harvested 40 bushels of seed heads, bagging 20 for trade and emergency food, leaving the rest attached to main stems. For 3 weeks, the house disappeared. Clara cut dry stalks into 4-foot lengths. She bound them into dense bundles, 6 inches thick, with tarred twine. She stacked bundles horizontally between cedar stakes and cabin walls, packing them tight like courses of stone. By mid-October, northern and western walls were encased in a 34-inch shell of stalk, dried leaf, and trapped air. From the road, the house resembled an enormous hayrick built around a stone chimney. Then came scratching in the dark. On the night of October 16th, Nora woke up and gripped her blanket to her chin. "Mother," the girl whispered. "The floor is moving." Clara struck a match, lit the candle, and held it to corner floorboards. Beneath the bottom log, where wood met stone foundation, gray fur flickered in the light. A field vole slipped through dried mud chinking, followed by another. Harvest had brought thousands of mice from river bottoms. The warm, dry casing was an inviting winter den. If rodents chewed through chinking, they would foul grain barrels, ruin dried meat, and destroy harness leather within weeks. Angus Reed's warning had arrived. Clara did not buy traps or poison. She took her skinning knife, went out into 20-degree frost, and slit cords on the lower 3 feet of the entire northern casing. 2 weeks of heavy labor crashed into frozen weeds. At dawn, she hitched the dog to the handcart and walked 2 miles south to dry alkali coulees. She spent 12 hours cutting wild mountain sagebrush, thorny buffalo burr, and wormwood. Sage was thick, woody, and saturated with bitter oils that made eyes water. She rebuilt the lower casing from dirt up. She packed 8 inches of thorny buffalo burr directly against bottom logs. She wove bitter sagebrush throughout bundles, dusting interior seams with cayenne pepper and clean wood ash. By the 4th morning, scratching stopped entirely. The sharp thorns held the perimeter, and the bitter vapors sealed the foundation. Sharp burrs tore at rodents' feet, and heavy sage fumes drove mice back toward river bottoms. Clara knotted the final hemp line as the sun dropped behind the Bitterroot Range. Her hands were swollen and bleeding from fine thorns, but the base was silent as a stone tomb. A wall that cannot defend itself is only a trap with a roof. On the 1st day of November, Clara drove a brass screw into the interior log wall, 10 feet from the cast-iron stove, and hung an 8-inch glass thermometer. Beside it, she hung a ruled ledger. Twice each day, at first dawn and before damping the fire at night, she recorded outdoor temperature on the porch, indoor temperature by the table, and number of pine billets burned. When Vance Gable delivered salt pork and green coffee, he saw the ledger open under the lamp. He turned pages with a grease-stained thumb, chuckling until spectacles slid down his nose. "Keeping a balance sheet on frost, Clara?" Gable said from the doorway. You can write 50 below until ink freezes. Winter doesn't pay debts, and it doesn't read books. When the big gale comes from Canada, pencil marks won't keep your daughter's toes from freezing. Numbers tell what wood does, Clara said, carrying salt to the pantry. A 7-foot wood pile tells the truth, Gable barked, stepping to his wagon. Silas Thorne has 30 cords of red fir stacked right now. You have barely 6 cords behind your shed. If you get cut off in January, the county isn't plowing 3 miles off the main road to haul firewood to a weed patch. That evening, temperature dropped to 8 degrees above zero under a clear, star-filled sky. Inside, the stove burned red on pine limbs, but Buck refused to lie on his blanket by the hearth. The dog walked back and forth along the north wall, whining into baseboards, hair standing up along his spine. Every few minutes, he pawed at the seam, growling into dark wood. Clara took a candle from the table and held the flame against the northern log seam. 3 feet from the floor, near the central corner, the flame flared blue, bent flat, and blew out in a sharp trail of white smoke. She went outside with her knife and peeled back 3 bundles of casing. Concealed behind stalks lay an 18-inch vertical void. When upper bundles settled under weight, they had caught on an uneven knot in the outer log, creating a hollow chimney between dry stalks and timber. The void was acting as a draft flue. Instead of holding dead air against the house, the gap drew cold air from the foundation, accelerating it against bare pine logs, sucking interior heat straight through mud chinking. The wall built to protect her child was acting like a blast furnace in reverse. If a 70-mile-per-hour blizzard hit that void, pressure drop would rip chinking from logs within an hour. The house would freeze from the inside out. The most dangerous enemy is the flaw you built with your own hands. Clara did not wait for daylight. By the light of a tin lantern hung from eaves, she cut twine on the center section of the north wall. Outdoor air stood at 6 below zero. Her breath froze into white crystals on her collar. Fingers were so numb, she had to strike the chisel with the heel of her palm. Nora stood by the handcart in the dark, passing split cedar laths and bundles of sage. Clara nailed horizontal cedar baffles every 18 inches up exterior log faces, securing them with cut-iron nails. She packed each compartment with cross-laid rye stalks and sunflower pith, ramming material home with the blunt head of her splitting maul until no air could move. When sun broke over eastern rimrock, the wall was sealed tight. It looked no different than the day before. Nora leaned against the wheelbarrow, eyes red from smoke and cold. "Does it look right now, Mother?" the girl asked. Clara wiped frost from her eyelashes with the back of her mitten. "The eye does not matter," she said. "The wind will inspect every inch." 3 days later, an old buckboard wagon rattled up from the south bench. It was old Samuel Finch. Finch was 70 years old and had lived in high Montana basins before the territory had a name. He ran no cattle and cut no timber. He had survived the killing winter of 1867 in an open sod dugout by watching elk migration and bark growth on cottonwoods. The basin called him the Weather Reader. When Finch moved mules to river bottoms, ranchers brought stock off high range. The old man climbed down, knees cracking like dry pine branches. He did not speak. He walked slowly around all 4 walls, dragging bare knuckles across the rough face of dried sunflower bundles. He tested tension on tarred hemp lines. He plunged long fingers into seams, feeling for drafts. He bent down and examined the dense barrier of thorny burrs along foundation sills. He stood by the northwest corner for 5 minutes, staring into dark gray cloud banks hanging over the Bitterroot Range. "Mountain sheep came down to the creek 10 days early," Finch said, voice sounding like iron shoes on gravel. "Lake ice is 4 inches thick before Thanksgiving. This is not a winter storm, Mrs. Vance. This is the Black Freeze, the kind that splits living pine trees down the core and kills horses where they stand in corrals. Clara stood on the porch, hands tucked in her apron. "Will the timber hold?" she asked. Finch turned pale blue eyes toward the thick wall. "Timber never holds," Finch said softly. "Cold eats timber like dry grass. Where did you learn to build a dead air envelope?" "In the Volga territory," Clara said, "from my husband's mother." The old man nodded once. He climbed back onto his wagon seat, picked up leather lines, and looked down. "Men at the store are laying bets you won't last until New Year's," Finch said. "Fools who think wood is thick because it is heavy. Pray your knots hold when the glass drops. Widow, nature is coming to balance its books." He whipped his mules and rattled down the frozen trail toward the river. When old men stop laughing, the time for doubt is past. On the morning of December 4th, the barometer on the mercantile porch dropped 1 full inch of mercury in 4 hours. Air smelled of broken flint and ozone. The sky was a flat, lead-colored ceiling hanging 50 feet above the cabin chimney. At noon, breeze died completely. Smoke from Clara's stove rose 400 feet into the air in a thin, unbroken gray line. Then, from 30 miles north, came a deep roar that shook dry glass in cabin window panes. It sounded like 20 locomotives running full throttle across an iron bridge. The great white wolf of the Arctic had broken its chain. The barometric floor had fallen out, and the mountain air turned to powdered steel. At 1 o'clock, the thermometer read 26 degrees above zero. By 3 o'clock, it dropped to 18 below. By dusk, the spirit column plunged past 42 below zero and vanished into the bottom bulb. Blizzard struck Black Ridge Basin with concussive shock, blowing the front door inward against its iron latch. Wind roared off granite plateaus at 65 miles per hour, carrying pulverized ice that cut skin like powdered glass. Visibility dropped to 12 inches. 300 yards south, catastrophe began at Silas Thorne's ranch within 4 hours. Thorne's house was built of 10-inch square hewn yellow pine timbers, chinked with lime mortar and reinforced with iron corner brackets. But solid pine is an open door to conductive heat loss in 60-mile Arctic blows. Screaming wind stripped thermal film from logs faster than 2 stoves could burn red fur. By midnight, mortar chinking in Thorne's north bedroom shrank, shattered under temperature shock, and blew into the room in clouds of white dust. Wind found 40 fissures between timber courses. Frost began growing across interior faces of logs, spreading like white fungus until the north wall was covered in solid ice. Thorne, his wife, and 2 sons dragged feather beds into the kitchen, stacked 6 cords of fur beside the hearth, and huddled beneath 8 wool blankets. The thermometer on Thorne's mantel read 24 degrees above zero. Water in the iron kettle froze solid 8 feet from the fire. Woodpile is down to 2 days. His wife screamed through the roar of the pipe, "Keep the firebox full." Thorne yelled back, mustache coated in white ice, "If this stove goes black for 30 minutes, we will never wake up." At the Vance homestead, the world had become silent. Outside, the gale threw tons of frozen gravel and ice against the cabin. Outermost dried leaves pulverized instantly, and loose twine ends snapped like rifle shots in darkness. Inside, the kerosene flame on the table did not flicker. The house was protected by 34 inches of dead air and dense fiber. When the gale struck outer casing, it did not hit an unyielding obstacle. It entered a labyrinth of millions of hollow cellulose chambers, dry sage, and rye stalks. Kinetic force of the gale was broken into a million tiny air currents. Moving air lost speed within the first 6 inches. By the time cold reached pine logs, wind was dead. Air against timber was completely motionless. Nora sat at the rough table in a simple dress and wool stockings, turning reader pages by steady lamplight. Buck lay on his side before the hearth, paws warm and twitching in a quiet dream. Clara dipped her steel nib into ink and opened the ledger. She looked at the brass thermometer 10 feet from the stove, 63 degrees. She recorded the hour, December 5th, 3:00 am. She recorded fuel, 2 billets of pine every 5 hours. She walked to the northern wall, removed her mitten, and laid her bare palm flat against interior pine logs. Timber was not cold. It was not damp. It was warm and dry to the touch, holding heat as though it were the middle of July. Outside, the storm performed its final calculation. Instead of stripping logs bare, driving snow was caught by hooked seed heads of outer sunflowers. It packed into exterior crevices, freezing into a wind-proof crust of rime ice that sealed the face like plaster. The storm had become the builder's assistant. Driving ice and snow welded the loose fibers into an impenetrable, monolithic crust. Snow created an airtight igloo shell over 30 inches of bone-dry cellulose pith, trapping dead air inside an impenetrable vault. The harder the blizzard blew, the thicker the protective ice shell became. The storm spent its fury building the very wall that defeated it. The blizzard raged for 54 hours without a break in the wind. When wind died on the morning of December 7th, Black Ridge Basin was an alien desert of 40-foot drifts. Morning sun rose into a sky so cold the air cut lungs like iron. Silas Thorne spent 3 hours hacking through frozen drifts that had sealed his heavy oak kitchen door to the lintel. Hands were swollen and cracked from the maul, his sheep shed crushed under 8 feet of snow. 30 ewes dead in North Corrals. His 4-cord pile of seasoned red fur was gone, reduced to chips and bark. He strapped on ash snowshoes and began the long walk up the north trail toward the Vance homestead. He expected to find a crushed roof, dead chimney, and 2 frozen bodies lying under blankets in a wooden tomb. He felt bitter shame for laughing at the mercantile while the widow worked alone in spring mud. As he reached the top of the ridge, Thorne stopped in his tracks. The Vance cabin stood in the center of the drift like a rounded, white fortress. Outer casing was covered in a thick, glittering crust of hard rime ice that reflected morning sun like polished stone. From the stone chimney, a thin, steady thread of blue wood smoke drifted straight into the frozen sky. Thorne walked down the snowbank, snowshoes sinking 6 inches into crust. He reached the heavy door and knocked with the wooden handle of his shovel. The door swung inward on iron hinges. A blast of dry, fragrant heat, smelling of cured pine, bitter sagebrush, and hot corn mush, hit Thorne in the chest. He stepped across the sill, dripping water onto scrubbed pine floorboards. Nora was sitting at the table, eating hot porridge from a tin bowl. The dog looked up, thumped his tail, and closed his eyes. Clara stood by the cookstove, holding an iron coffee pot. Thorne looked at the brass thermometer on the wall, 64 degrees. He looked at the corner. 5 cords of split pine remained neatly stacked to the ceiling. He walked over to the table and stared down at the open ledger. His eyes followed clean, black columns of ink. Deck 4, 6 p.m., outside 36 dashed, inside plus 62 H2 billets burned. Deck 5, 2:00 am, outside 48, inside plus 61 H2 billets burned. Deck 5, 10:00 am, outside 44, inside plus 63 H2 billets burned. Deck 6, 4 p.m., outside 38, inside plus 64 H2 billets burned. Thorne closed the ledger with shaking fingers. He stepped to the north wall, took off his leather glove, and pressed his bare palm hard against pine logs. The wood was completely dry. It felt like a board cured in an autumn barn. The rancher stood for a long time, head down, water dripping from his gray beard onto boots. "I burned 5 cords of fur in 60 hours, Mrs. Vance," Thorne whispered. his voice cracking with exhaustion and shame. My children were freezing under 8 blankets. My north bedroom is an icehouse. Clara did not smile. She poured a tin cup of black coffee and set it on the table before him. Wood tries to fight frost, Clara said quietly. Air stops it. Thorne looked at the widow, pride crushed against the cold truth of the balance sheet. I was wrong, he said. A man who argues with a thermometer is a fool. A man who argues with frost is dead. When April melt cleared wagon roads through Bitterroot Valley, Angus Reed brought his heavy team to the Vance homestead. The wagon was loaded with 300 cedar stakes and 10 pounds of wire. He left them by the fence without asking for a copper. Silas Thorne planted 50 bushels of Russian sunflower seed in a 6-foot belt around his stone house and sheep barns. By mid-July, 18 cabins across Black Ridge Basin were surrounded by towering green rings of sunflowers and rye. Jokes at Vance Gable's mercantile were never spoken again. Over the next 50 years, old cabins were torn down, railway replaced freight wagons, and names of early settlers were forgotten in county archives. But even today, along high benches of western Montana, old homestead cabins stand against northern wind, surrounded by dry, golden skeletons of autumn sunflowers. People living there do not always know the name of the widow who planted the first trench. They only know that when the Great Freeze comes down from Canada to test timber. The house that survives is not the one with the thickest logs. It is the house that knows how to wear a coat of air.